So Peirce had a background as a working scientist, and I take it that that informed his philosophical views. So the main goal I've got here is to say enough about what a Peircean account of art might look like to make it seem worth thinking about. He said very little about art. He started discussing aesthetics late in his career, and did so in a very non-standard way. So that's the main goal. I want to connect the account of art with other themes in his philosophy. I want to try to motivate this for people who don't ever think about American pragmatism by connecting it with some stuff in contemporary philosophy. And then I want to make some critical points, or a big critical point, about some contemporary historical definitions of art and how I think Peirce comes out, arguably looking better than they do on an important issue. So just to foreshadow where I'm going, Peirce thinks about art as a practice or as a mode of life, he says. And the fundamental thing about it is the spirit that animates the exemplary practitioners of this mode of life. And it's to be compared to, or I get there from thinking about his conception of the scientific mode of life. And so that's one of the conclusions I'm going to get to. What's the animating spirit of the scientific mode of life? That's a crucial typo there. The animating spirit of the scientific mode of life centers on the scientific good. The animating spirit of the artistic life centers on the aesthetic good. So that's a much more commonsensical sort of thing to say. The aesthetic good is what would be pleasure, Peirce says, to the fully developed aesthetic Superman, or the sufficiently mature agent. And I'll compare this to Peirce's account of truth, and I'll claim that he addresses a problem that historical views face. And then I will also compare his view of art as a practice to an influential theory of natural kinds, Richard Boyd's homeostatic property cluster theory of natural kinds. So here we go. Here's the plan. I'm going to talk about pragmatism and very briefly distinguish Peirce's account from other types of pragmatism. I'll talk about science as a mode of life. I'll generalize that to art, and then I'll step back and ask, well, wait a minute. Having got the view just stated, does this even make any sense? And so I'll try to motivate it a little bit. Then I'll talk about practices as Peircean natural kinds. Then I'll go into more detail on art as a practice, and then finally I'll do this comparative thing. We okay here so far? So what Peirce's pragmatism isn't, it's not the view that practical values override theoretical values. And it's specifically not the view that practical interests or usefulness has priority over truth. It's not the view that truth is a matter of what's good or convenient to believe. And it's not the view that the point of theorizing is to do any of those things. So Peirce is a pragmatist who is very big on the role of theory, in contrast to some of the other pragmatists. James once said, or at least Peirce said, he said that truth should be defined in terms of the satisfactory, and Peirce's response was, satisfactory for what? That's a two-place predicate. We don't even know what you mean until you said what. So, and what is it? So the main point here is that he's got a theoretical orientation in pragmatism. He once characterized it as a laboratory philosophy. And the thought was, he said, that it's a method for ascertaining the meaning of concepts. And if we want to figure out what concepts mean, we should think about the way scientists use them. And that is to think about them as having conceivable observational consequences, a conceivable bearing on conduct. He goes so far as to say the meaning of any concept is completely exhausted by an accurate account of all the conceivable experimental consequences, where experimental is very broadly construed. So pragmatism, so conceived, can tell us how to make our concepts clearer and what it is for them to be clearer. How do we make our concepts clearer if we think about concepts the way scientists think about concepts? That's what we should do in philosophy. That's how we can make progress in philosophy. So in a famous paper, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, Peirce distinguished 3 grades of clarity. At the first grade of clarity, we can just identify instances of a concept. So this thing is hard, this thing is not hard. That's useful, but obviously it doesn't have much theoretical weight. At the second grade, we can give a real or we can give a verbal or nominal definition. We can give maybe necessary and sufficient conditions. So we define hardness as resistance to abrasion, one kind of hardness. And that seems to be what the usual definitions of art aim at. At the third grade of clarity, we can derive future expectations about experimental consequences from hypotheses containing that concept. So if I want to say that something is hard, I want to be able to describe experiments we could do and the consequences that would follow. So if anyone were to exert pressure on that glass with a diamond, the glass but not the diamond would scratch. So that's to hook it up with observational consequences, and Peirce probably had in mind specific tests. So hardness or any property becomes an experimentally verifiable property. And to put it slightly exaggeratedly, hardness is what justification do we have for saying that such a property is hardness? Answer, it explains something. What does it explain? It explains scratches. So if we couldn't do that with hardness, we wouldn't have the term wouldn't mean anything. So a couple examples of how to operationalize this. If you think about Peirce's definition of truth, traditional definition, correspondence to reality. Pragmatic question, how do we figure that? What does that mean? We're stuck with words here, propositions, correspondence, reality. Not so helpful. The real definition of truth, that is a pragmatic definition, what the ideal community of inquirers following the right methods would settle on at the end of inquiry. That's all that there could be to truth. There's no meaning to the notion of truth beyond that. If you think that you mean something more than that by truth, you're speaking in a way that's incompatible with sense and with pragmatism. Similarly, for reality, we might define reality as what is as it is, independent of the way it's represented as being in any representation, but that's just a nominal definition. What's a pragmatic definition? What's real is what's represented in the final opinion. Which ends up being what's independent of the vagaries of me and you. Now note, Peirce is not predicting that the community of inquirers will converge on a single view. That's a hope, a hypothesis, a presupposition, an ideal. It's not a prediction about the future. So I want to say, as I will a couple more times, to construe this as an ideal, I think, is to say something that's pragmatically respectable. If we say that somebody's committed to an ideal, that claim has experimental consequences. We can determine whether that's true or not. Are they committed to an ideal? So this is not in other words, this view about truth being an ideal is pragmatically respectable. So on to the main analogy or model. So as I say, Peirce spent his life doing science. I want to talk about his conception of science, and I'm going to model the account of art on that conception. So here's what he says. Science is a mode of life adhered to by people whose single animating spirit is to find out the truth, which pursues this purpose by a well-considered method and seeks cooperation in the hope truth may be found. It's not organized knowledge. It's inquiry into truth for its own sake. Crucial claim. It doesn't matter how much you know or how good your methods are. If you're doing inquiry in this spirit, animated by a disinterested desire to find out the truth, you're doing science. Doesn't matter how bad your knowledge base is, doesn't matter how bad your methods are. It's the animating spirit that makes you a scientist or not a scientist. Now that's a slight exaggeration, but he's being a little bit rhetorical, but that's a crucial claim. And Peirce talks an awful lot about habit. He doesn't use the term virtue that much, but he seems to think that there are virtues that come with this scientific attitude, the love of the truth. And one of them is going to be perhaps curiosity. One of them is going to be honesty so extreme that you're willing to dump all your beliefs on the spot if you find out that they're wrong. Peirce says that's a sublime attitude. And sort of other or community spiritedness, identifying your own rational interests with those of the community. So you're putting the intellectual good of the community in the long run at the heart of your values. So these are, again, ideal traits of character. Of course, real scientists have all sorts of motives for what they do. But these are all organized around the ideal of truth, right? You want to find out the truth. You value the truth over other things that ordinarily motivate us. And the truth is that we get the truth is more important than that I get the truth. So what does it mean to be devoted to truth? I think it means in part having those virtues. And so if those are experimentally or observationally detectable, then so is the ideal. This sort of repeats what I said before. If you don't have adequate knowledge or good methods, you're sort of off the hook as far as your character goes. If that's your scientific character, if it's beyond your control that you know the little that you know or have the methods that you have, as bad as they may be. So again, I want to say this is an experimentally meaningful hypothesis. There's an interesting book by Robert Pennock, a philosopher of science, called An Instinct for Truth, Curiosity, and the Moral Character of Science. And Pennock actually does empirical studies on what motivates scientists, and these are on his list. So I think you can investigate questions about what people regard as virtues. Now, the main move here is to say, here's the account of science. Let's generalize it and build an account of truth out of it. So we've got science as a growing cooperative mode of life, art as a growing cooperative mode of life, aimed at an ideal fundamental good, aimed at an ideal aesthetic good or object of desire. The animating spirit is to find out the truth or embody that good, and there are virtues that come with the commitment to that good. So this raises questions, of course, many questions. What the heck is the aesthetic good? In what sense is art fundamentally cooperative? And what are the artistic virtues, if this analogy is going to be any good? But prior question, what is this stuff about practices being fundamentally defined by the animating spirit of exemplary practitioners? Is that just, what's up with that? Is that actually have any plausibility, or is it just sort of interesting fact about Peirce that he had this unusual view? So I want to try to motivate the view a little bit and say, well, we shouldn't reject it out of hand. Why it's not completely crazy to buy this stuff about the animating spirit of the exemplary practitioners. Three kinds of considerations in favor of that: some stuff about the philosophy of science, some stuff about ethics, and some stuff about aesthetics. So I'm trying to make it seem like it's not crazy to think that animating spirit is what defines the relevant community here. So far, so good. We on track here? So first point in its favor. I say you might wonder, how do we demarcate scientific theories? You might think we can do it in terms of how to demarcate science from pseudoscience or non-science. You might think, well, it's in terms of the theories, true theories. That's what makes for science. Good methods, that's what makes for science. But that seems problematic. A lot of scientific theories are false. A lot of science has been done using flawed methods that we wouldn't want to exclude. So that doesn't seem like it can be the criterion. Very interesting paper by James Ladyman. I don't know whether he ever followed up on it, but Ladyman appeals to Harry Frankfurt's notion of bullshit. I don't know if you folks know this notion. The bullshitter is the person who is essentially indifferent to truth. The liar cares about truth. They don't want us to get it. The bullshitter may speak the truth or not. It doesn't really matter to them. And Ladyman says, okay, science is to pseudoscience as truthfulness is to bullshit. So the pseudoscientist is a bullshitter, basically, not so interested in the truth. And pseudoscience is to scientific fraud as bullshit is to lies. So far, so good. Okay, so that seems to me to be very much in the Peircean spirit. What are bullshitters animated by? Well, it's not a desire for truth, but it's sort of the desire to, I don't know, get through a difficult social situation or something like that. Why, whatever it is that motivates bullshitters. And so I want to say, if we can detect the spirit with which people act, and I think we often can, then, and bullshit is a kind of an animating spirit, then we can detect that. And so this is me, not Ladyman. Art is to forgery as science is to science fraud. And science is to pseudoscience as art is to pseudo art. So the details of the analogy don't matter, but the point is, forgers trying to deceive us. Somebody making pseudo art doesn't really care. There, if it works to serve some purpose, it works. The details of the analogy don't matter. My point is, if you could take a plausible stab at demarcating science from pseudoscience on the basis of an appeal to bullshit, then that's tantamount to an animating spirit. And so that's tantamount to saying, okay, characterizing science in terms of an animating spirit is not a crazy idea right off the bat. So that's the first point. Second point, to motivate this, I've already mentioned that if you are following the best method you know, even though it's no good, and you're trying to find out the truth, you deserve at least an honorary place in the vestibule of science. We shouldn't exclude you completely. From the other direction, Peirce says, if you're following good methods, but your desires are corrupt, you don't want to find out the truth, but you want to prove a point, or vindicate a general way of looking at things. He says you're not a genuine scientist. We can't exclude you completely, but you're not exemplary. So analogy to the moral case. The spirit with which we do things has a bearing on how much moral credit we deserve. So a judge, I like this case, a judge might pass the right sentence for the right reasons, but do so because she likes making criminals suffer. That affects her morally. That's to her moral discredit. It's the spirit with which she acts. If the if you do something in a certain spirit, that can reflect well or badly on your character. All right, question if that makes sense in the moral case, and it makes sense in the scientific case, why couldn't it make sense in the aesthetic case? I don't have to have that last bit. I just want to make it somewhat plausible, plausible enough to go on, that the spirit with which we act has effects on our character and the moral evaluation of our actions. So that's the second point in favor of the view that this stuff about animating spirit is not completely nuts. Third point, in support of the claim that the stuff about animating spirit makes some kind of sense. In a paper called A Portrait of the Artist as an Aesthetic Expert, Buckner and McGuire, I guess that's pronounced, say, okay, here's a view. For every artwork, there must be some aesthetic concept such that possession of that concept is constitutive of its production, the production of the artwork. And they say, well, that's got experimental consequences. If it were true, then we'd predict, if we looked at scientific experts, that they have certain traits. They've got better motor abilities for reliably imbuing objects with aesthetic properties than non-experts. And they've got distinctive strategies for detecting relationships between structural and aesthetic properties. Okay, if that were true, we'd predict that artistic experts have these traits, and they do. That's these guys' view. My response is, well, that seems to leave out something important. What motivates artistic experts? Like, it can't be, it seems like, just the ability to do this stuff. It's, from the present perspective, that you really value aesthetic properties, that you're really focused on them, that you really are interested in them. And so this seems to me like a kind of a technocratic, spiritless, if you like, account of what it is to be an artistic expert. Yes, those might be necessary conditions, but maybe not even necessary conditions. What you really want is a desire to realize aesthetic properties, or that would be the view, the right spirit. So that's all supposed to motivate the idea that the animating spirit talk is meaningful talk. Now, got a lot of pieces in play here. But I think this is an important piece. I want to talk briefly about Peircean's theory of natural kinds. Because practices are natural kinds, or modes of life are natural kinds. So Peirce was influenced by Whewell, who was an influence on Darwin. Amazing character, who developed a cluster view of natural kinds. And this is before Darwin. He's construing natural kinds as essentially probabilistic, statistical, not sharply edged kinds. So this is a cluster view long before the folks we tend to think about cluster views in connection with. Now, in the contemporary philosophy of science, Richard Boyd has a view according to which natural kinds are homeostatic property clusters. And Boyd had originally focused on biological species. What's a homeostatic property cluster? It's a family of properties that co-occurs, that clumps together in property space. And the properties hang together because the presence of some favors the presence of others. Or there are mechanisms that tend to maintain them as co-occurring. Now, if you follow the contemporary definition of art literature, I hope you'll think this is relevant stuff. Homeostatic mechanisms, strength admits of degrees, so the naturalness of a kind admits of degrees. It's not that you've got natural kinds and everything else. We've got minimally natural kinds and then harder edged natural kinds. Something can be a member of a kind without possessing all of the properties in the cluster. We don't individuate them extensionally, and we can apply them to things other than the objects of the sciences. Feudal economy is a natural kind, a homeostatic property cluster. Philosophical views can be homeostatic property clusters. There's a whole bunch of views that are kind of in the ballpark of behaviorism. Money is. Ron Mallon has talked about race, gender, and other things. So the point is, the view's got some kind of theoretical ambitions to try to make sense of a bunch of different kinds of kinds. and in this very much in this not necessary and sufficient conditions way. So I don't know whether Boyd read Peirce, but this is very Peircean, so to speak. Peirce talks about what he calls purposive natural classes. Think of purposes as dispositions or habits or laws or tendencies. So the animating spirit of a practice is its purpose. What's a purpose? It's an operative desire. It's a desire realizing itself. These are merely tendencies. They're not exceptionless. Importantly, Peirce is a realist about dispositions. And now 5 points, the last of which has special bearing on the art question. Purposes dictate only some but not all qualities of the processes they govern. They're not detailed. Crucially, purposes, habits, tendencies, dispositions can undergo change. Crucially, they can be multiply instantiated. And even more to the present point, purposes, tendencies, dispositions, habits usually interact in the world with other subsidiary purposes. So Peirce's example is a lamp. What's a lamp? It's a class of artifacts. What brings that class into existence? The purpose of the people who make them, namely to produce something that makes for illumination. But that's not the only story. When people make lamps, there are a whole bunch of other purposes they have. You can't break the bank. You can't burn the house down. It can't be horribly ugly light if you can get away with it. So likewise, art involves various subsidiary purposes, we might think. It's a complex of purposes. So 2 payoffs here, I think, both of which Peirce is explicit about. If this picture is right, then the properties of members of purposive natural classes are going to cluster. Why? Because you've got a bunch of competing purposes and they can't all be maximally realized simultaneously. So you're going to get clustering of properties. And second explicit lesson, purposive natural classes are not going to be sharply demarcated. They're going to overlap. We would predict that. So editorial comment, isn't this better than talking about this metaphor of family resemblance? Doesn't this give us some more explanatory purchase than family resemblance? Rhetorical question. Finally, interesting point, I think. The fact that natural kinds are vague is an indication of the fact that they're real, according to Peirce. He thinks if you've got really sharp boundaries in a concept, that's evidence that it's artificial. That's evidence that it's a human creation. So where are the sharpest, which concepts have the sharpest boundaries? Mathematical concepts, presumably, right? I mean, we can give definitions and they're really tight. If this is right, then taking mathematical concepts as the model for thinking about philosophical concepts is a bad idea. We shouldn't think about philosophical concepts as the same way we think about mathematical concepts. We should think of them as probably coming with fuzzy boundaries, probably predictably overlapping with other classes. That's what we would predict. And then more radically characteristically, Peirce thinks actually precision is a special case of vagueness and not the other way around. Are you with me here? It's not the case that vagueness is sort of failed precision. It's that precision is a limiting case of vagueness, and that's a characteristically Peircean point to invert the usual way of thinking about these things. So the point of this excursion, I hope that people can see that there are sort of implications for thinking about art from thinking about natural classes this way. I've tried to indicate a couple of them. Okay, back to the details now on the account of art. There's the account again, a cooperative mode of life aimed at an ideal aesthetic good whose exemplary practitioner's animating spirit is desire to realize or embody the aesthetic good. So let's work up to the aesthetic good. What's the aesthetic perspective? First of all, well, Kant says it's the perspective we take when we consider anything without regard to any ulterior considerations of utility, interest, morality, or truth. Well, that sounds like straight Kant. It's unclear whether Peirce read the third critique. He must have read it, but we don't know that. We know he read the first critique really, really carefully. We know he read the second critique carefully, but there doesn't seem to be any real evidence that he read the third critique, which would be really bizarre. But anyway, this is obviously super Kantian. So here's the aesthetic good. The aesthetically good are closely akin to pleasure and pain. What would be pleasure and pain to the fully developed Superman, the sufficiently mature agent? So far, so good. So that should be surprising, I hope. So the aesthetic good is what would cause pleasure in the sufficiently mature agent who attended to something from this perspective. Okay, let me try to say a little bit by way of making that less brow furrowing. I saw your furrowed brow there. Don't furrow your brow. So a little bit more about this conception of pleasure and pain for the sufficiently mature agent. Pleasure and pain are second order feelings, he says, feelings attaching to themselves or excited by other feelings. More specifically, the feeling of pain is a symptom of a feeling which repels us. The feeling of pleasure is a symptom of a feeling that attracts us. Compare Kant's view of pleasure. I think in the same neck of the woods. Causality directed at a subject state so as to keep him in that state, him or her. It's what I want to continue. What's pain? What do pains have in common? Not some phenomenological essence. What do pleasures have in common? Not some phenomenological essence, rather something to do with approach and avoidance. So to try to fill this out a little bit, and this is kind of speculative on my part, we're confronted by something. Could be anything. An object, something in our minds. We experience it in its immediate qualitative presentness. That's a Peircean sort of phrase, just as it strikes us. Not with respect to its truth, its utility, its interest, its practical use. If the quality of its appearance attracts us, that's a sympathetic feeling. Pleasure is a feeling that's a symptom of that sympathetic feeling. It's a second order feeling about this first order feeling. If the quality of the appearance alone repels us, we think that's an anti-sympathetic feeling. Pain is a symptom of that. And then we infer on the basis of these feelings that are symptoms of these first order feelings that the object is aesthetically good. That's an abstraction. So think about the case of hardness. Hardness is what explains scratching or scratches. And it might be that there's no such thing as hardness, right? I mean, we could have a concept that was just empty, but it turns out there is experimental data. Aesthetic goodness, aesthetic bad are explanatory concepts. These, of course, if we predicate aesthetic goodness, that's a hypothesis. It's a fallible judgment. We could be wrong, right? I say this thing is aesthetically good, could be wrong. And because, and this is a point he makes explicitly, attraction and repulsion are volitional. And what that does is to hook up, talk about aesthetic goodness with observable consequences. We can detect attraction and we can detect repulsion. That's the idea. We can tell when people are attracted or repulsed. And what he's doing here is working up these first order brute attraction / repulsion reactions. The objects are just hitting us a certain way, and then we're going on to work that up into something more abstract. So are we okay so far, more or less? So again, I pause and say, okay, is this just another place where where he's just talking this crazy talk, like sufficiently mature agent? What's up with that? Can we try to make that a little bit more plausible, please? Well, a couple things to say in that connection. The first one is that this connects with his conception of truth, as you will remember. What's truth? It's what the community would settle down in. Is there any actual such community? Maybe not. Maybe never. Maybe the earth will be, all life will be extinguished from the universe in the next 10 minutes. But that doesn't affect the status of this as an ideal. So far, so good. So truth, the community of inquirers, aesthetic goodness, the ideal sensibility. So the ideal inquirers, the ideal sensibility. That's the parallel. Okay, that's just to connect it with Peirce. Second point that will have occurred to some of you folks, if any of you are in aesthetics, and I know some of you are, this should remind you of the standard of taste. The true standard of taste is the joint verdict of true judges wherever they are to be found. So this is a little argument that James Shelley gives. Not everybody agrees with this, but the true critics can never be wrong, and every actual judge can be wrong. So the true critics are not actual folks. That's pretty much verbatim from a paper of his. Secondly, a conclusion he draws as well. If this is right, then wherever the true judges are to be found means actual or possible, born or unborn. In other words, they're not, it may be that there are people today who agree with the true judges. That may be the case. But maybe not. So this is to try to establish some sympathy for the view. If you've got any sympathy for Hume, you shouldn't reject this out of hand, is my thought. A difference, Peirce is a realist about modality. Not a David Lewis style realist, but a realist. He thinks that he's not a nominalist. He thinks we can make out claims about possibilities. He's not a David. Don't furrow your brow at me. He's not a David Lewis style realist. He doesn't think there are actual concrete worlds which ground our modal talk. But he does think that modal claims can be true. And that there is something in reality that makes them true. And it seems to me that's an advantage over Hume's account of modal claims, which is pretty thin. So that's the aesthetic good. That's the sufficiently mature agent. I think I'm going to skip that. How am I doing on time?
You're fine. 10 or even 15 minutes.
Okay. I think I won't talk about this, but if anybody wants me to talk more about the education, the affective education that would get us to the sufficiently mature agent, I can talk about that. I can also be quick with this. If you'll remember, the way the analogy goes is for the model, modes of life are essentially communal. The scientific mode of life is essentially communal. Art is a mode of life. So art ought to be, if this analogy is to work, essentially communal. But how does that work? It's the question. What's essentially communal about the artistic mode of life? And here, this is a bit speculative, but it seems to me that there are a bunch of interesting connections between Collingwood's theory of art and Peirce's. And this is partly as a result of having a lot of conversations with David Collins, who's written a bunch of really interesting stuff about Collingwood. This is a kind of a Collingwoodian take on a Peircean account of art. And here's the thought. You're an artist, something strikes you as interesting. Whatever, just rings your bell. And so you want to know more about it. You want to nurture it or explore it or develop it or clarify it. How do you do that? You try to embody that thing and its characteristic values in some kind of medium, some kind of vehicle. Could be notation in your head, could be a physical object. In doing so, you've produced a sign or an interpretation or representation of what it was in that object that struck you. And you've done so in an attempt to clarify it. Given what's just been said, that's an attempt to realize the aesthetic good. This thing seemed interesting. And now I want to understand it and nurture it and embody it. So I produce something else that will do that. That's an attempt to realize the aesthetic good. If my first try doesn't work, I edit. I produce another version. And I do the same thing with that again and again and again and again till I get to something that I think is closer to what was there. Every subsequent modification or embodiment is a representation of a preceding one. So first draft. So first version of the poem I write is a reaction to some experience I had. I don't think I've got it quite right, so I write another version. I don't think that's quite right, so I write another version. I don't think that's quite right, so I write another version. Each of those is an embodiment of the original thing and an embodiment of the subsequent, of the previous thing. And note, I think interestingly, and I wish I had more time to talk about this, but I can shift back and forth between the vehicle as an embodiment of that feeling and the vehicle just as a thing in itself, focusing on properties that are not relevant to its embodying nature. So a brushstroke I might treat as a rendering of a leaf, or I might just think, man, that color for its own sake is super, super interesting and great. So I'm not really thinking about it as a leaf color anymore. I'm just focusing on the sign that I've got in front of me. So that's supposed to be a Collingwoody flavored account. How do we get to the communal? Well, in two ways. This is kind of a thin sense of the communal, but the basic idea is expression. This is a kind of expression theory. Expression is a semiotic process, and all use of signs is Peirce thinks dialogical. That is, I produce a sign, even if in my own head, for my own benefit, which I then interpret and then go on to do things with or not. And what's dialogical is communal. So we get at least a thin sense of the communal nature. Expression is semiotic, the semiotic is dialogical, the dialogical is communal. So expression is communal. That's a thin sense. A slightly thicker sense, also from Collingwood, but I think Peirce would have agreed with this. Most of our emotions are shared by other people in the community, with differences, of course, as a matter of degree. But if that's true, if most of our emotions are shared by others, then the artist, in making art, is trying to interpret and understand feelings that they share with the community. Because none of our feelings are unique to us. That's the thought. And so what does audience reception involve? It involves judging whether or not the artist has expressed and clarified feelings that they share with the artist. That's the general picture. And so Collingwood says, artists have always been in the habit of treating the public as collaborators. Like, have I expressed this feeling correctly? I don't know. Myself, I can't trust my own judgments. I need to submit them to other people to see whether have I expressed what we're feeling? All right. Last big section. I claimed that this view I made many claims about the virtues of this view, and among them was the claim that this does something that definitions of art need to do, that some contemporary definitions of art don't do very well. And that class is the historical definitions due to Levinson, Carroll, and with some qualifications, Robert Stecker. The core idea is that something is art just in virtue of standing in an appropriate historical relation to preceding art. Art doesn't have any intrinsic essence. It's just defined historically relationally. So obvious challenge, gosh, we're historically related to single-celled organisms, but we're not single-celled organisms. Not all historical connections preserve identity. So think about the practices and motivations of some rarefied branch of science. They're historically related to the practices and motivations of pre-humans trying to attract mates. But that doesn't make them the same kind of motivation. So obvious question, which historical connections preserve continuity of the art tradition? Does the question make sense here? We got to be able to say some do and some don't. So representative example, Noel Carroll's historical narrativism. Something is an artwork if it was created by an artist in an artistic concept with a recognized and live artistic motivation and a result of being so created, as a result of being so created, stands in the right relation to at least one acknowledged artwork. Well, obviously we have to break out of the circle here somehow, right? We've got a lot of art cognates here. What does that? As I read Carroll, it's the independent account he gives of artistic motivation. What makes, so if we give an independent account of artistic motivation, we could break out of this circle here. What makes a motivation artistic? It's repudiating, amplifying, and repeating something in an existing art tradition. So far, so good. Well, we still got the problem about the existing art tradition, but here's an account of what it is to repudiate, which I think is what does all the work. We reject something along some dimension where that rejection is conceivable in the context and where it involves the rediscovery or reinvention of some part of the context. So it's not a full-scale revolution. You repudiate some aspects, but maintain contact with other aspects of it. It's not just a big change of the subject. Otherwise, it won't do the work we want it to do. So I want to now give a reductio of this view. Consider a view about making blue tiles, which is a practice, the practice of making blue tiles, and call it blue tile making historical narrativism. And this is in parallel. What are blue tiles? Things created by a blue tile maker in a blue tile making context with a recognized and live blue tile making motivation. So far so good, parallel to the art case. I say, well, look, the blue tile making tradition has several dimensions: the hue focused dimension, the brightness focused dimension, the saturation focused dimension. These are properties of colors. Well, it seems like if you repeatedly repudiated, amplified, and repeated, you could have any one of those strands coming to dominate the rest. But if that's right, suppose that the blue tile makers are repudiating tiles along the hue dimension consistently, but maintaining contact with the brightness and saturation dimensions. They can end up making green tiles. Then they might end up making red tiles. So far, so good. But think about tiles. They have lots of different dimensions: shape, size, weight, composition. So those can be progressively repudiated. Sooner or later, the practice is going to end up making anything whatsoever. Blue tile making is going to be any making practice whatsoever. How? By the process of repudiation, amplification, and repetition. So the implication is the practice of making blue tiles is the same practice as the practice of making red tiles, or the practice of making any damn thing you want. That's absurd. Reductio. We have to say, if this happened, the tradition ended. That's the end of the tradition. It's replaced by something else. I hope the parallel is obvious. Art, as I pointed out in connection with homeostatic property clusters, has got a bunch of purposes, a bunch of different dimensions. Aesthetic, moral, economic, political, social. So far, so good. The parallel is supposed to be that repudiating, amplifying, and repeating could morph this tradition into any tradition whatsoever, just as the blue tile tradition can be morphed into the red tile tradition or the any kind of making tradition at all you like. I think that's a reductio. It's incumbent on us to say that it's important to be careful here. The motivation cannot undergo absolutely any change and remain the same kind of motivation. And it's the motivation that does the work. It's not that the motivation couldn't change into any other kind of motivation. Of course it could. The question is, can it change into any other kind of motivation and remain the same kind of motivation? That's the question. And I think the answer to that has got to be no. Otherwise, artistic practices are immortal. They can't end. Whatever they turn into, they're still art practices. They can't stop. To try to diagnose this, I'm almost done. Try to diagnose this. What's the problem? If we characterize repudiating, amplifying, and repeating, it's totally generic. What do scientists do? They repudiate, amplify, and repeat scientific practices. What do legal theorists or lawyers or judges do? They RAR with a legal motivation. Any tradition or practice of any kind can be RAR'd in various ways, in various different spirits. So suppose we RAR'd a scientific practice in a mercantile spirit. We'd end up with a different kind of a practice, namely a mercantile practice, or a legal tradition in a, I don't know what the adjective is for etiquette, but in an etiquette-focused spirit. We'd turn a legal tradition into a tradition of etiquette. So RARing alone, while it preserves historical continuity, doesn't preserve identity. It's too blunt a tool. And of course, needless to say, we can't put another occurrence of artistic into the characterization of RARing, or we're still stuck in the same circle of words. Practices have multiple dimensions. They may interact. If so, then staying in contact with one needn't preserve the identity of the whole. If they're not equally important, staying in contact with some need not preserve the identity of the whole. But RARing is so generic, it has no way to screen out the ones that preserve identity from the ones that don't. I am inclined to think that this problem is a generic problem for historical theories. Any kind of historical theory, you need something to account for this continuity. And Robert Stucker actually appeals to Carroll's account as helping us out. I don't think it helps out. So what's the Peircean alternative? Of course, you know what I'm going to say. What unifies a practice or a spirit over time through transformations is the animating spirit of the people who are engaged in it. And that animating spirit is relatively invariant. It can undergo change, but it can't change into absolutely anything and remain the same animating spirit. That's the claim. So to give some examples, as I tried to suggest earlier, if science morphed into something animated solely by a political spirit or solely by a bullshit spirit, I want to say it wouldn't be science anymore. We might still call it science, but it wouldn't be science anymore. Likewise, the artistic spirit cannot persist through a change into absolutely any kind of spirit and not come to an end. So the thought is, close to the end, you might think this stuff about animating spirit is completely airy-fairy, but I think it's detectable. I think we do know fallibly the spirit that animates people. Sometimes it's really hard to figure out, but we're not completely in the dark about this. As with any homeostatic property cluster, the subsidiary purposes are going to vary. Some of them are going to come to be more or less prominent. Whether a mode of life is an artistic one, it's going to be a matter of degree, of course, like everything else. And then finally, to end with something completely unsympathetic. If you thought about personal identity, this seems to me that this is a kind of a reasonable conjecture about what makes for personal identity through time is the spirit that animates the being in question. Not mere psychological connectedness, not mere historical connectedness, not mere physical connectedness, but something about what animates the being in question. And so, thanks.